Good morning. My name is Rebecca Dorr, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. My colleague Janelle is going to be monitoring our chat box today, and we'll be adding some housekeeping items there. These monthly research forums feature research on emerging or key topics that really impact the field of early childcare and education. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome the Crane Center's own Dr. Laura Justice and Dr. Logan Pelfrey. Dr. Justice is a distinguished professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University, where she's also the executive director of the Schoenbaum Family Center and the Crane Center, and the director of the EHE centers. In these roles, she oversees the strategic growth of multiple interdisciplinary centers and research and service centers focused on improving outcomes for children and families. Dr. Justice is an internationally recognized expert in early language literacy and early childhood intervention, with particular expertise in the design and evaluation of scalable, evidence-based programs for children from historically marginalized and low-income communities. Her work has shaped understanding of how early learning environments, parenting practices, and educational systems influence children's language and literacy development from infancy through the early elementary grades. She has served as principal investigator on numerous large-scale federally funded initiatives supported by the National Institutes of Health, the Institute of Education Sciences, and major foundations, including long-running longitudinal studies focused on school readiness and early learning systems. Across her career, she secured more than 100 million in external research funding to advance early childhood science and policy. Dr. Pelfrey is a project director and research strategist at the Crane Center. He has over a decade of experience leading large-scale research projects that integrate mixed methods research, sensing technologies, and user-centered design to improve early learning environments and interventions. Dr. Pelfrey has directed and contributed to multiple large-scale multi-site studies examining peer interactions, language exposure, kindergarten transitions, and technology-supported literacy interventions, including mobile and sensor-based tools designed for real-world scalability. In addition to publishing in leading research journals, he regularly presents his work at national and international conferences and is deeply engaged in interdisciplinary collaboration that bridges research, product design, and educational practice. Today, Doctors Justice and Pelfrey will discuss the classroom experiences of preschoolers with language difficulties and effects of an intervention for increasing peer-to-peer interactions for children experiencing isolation. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Justice.
Thank you, Dr. Dorr. Good morning, everybody. Dialing in from Columbus, where it's sort of a London, UK, dreary type of morning. But I think it's going to get warm the rest of the week, so very exciting. I am presenting today with Logan Pelfrey, and we have been partners in crime for quite a while now, working on, oh, I can't change. There we go. Working on research focused on understanding children's largely verbal interactions with teachers and peers in early education settings. And I do want to acknowledge that while Logan and I have a deep codependent relationship, there are other folks who are heavily involved in this work who we cannot function without. Some of those: Tiffany Foster, Matt Brock, Ugo Gonzalez Villasanti, Sujung Lin, Kelly Pertel, Wei Jiang. And this work has been funded by the National Institute of Health as well as the Spencer Foundation. So what we are really interested in is what happens in classrooms. And I'm absolutely thrilled to see so many educators here, as well as supervisors and speech language pathologists. And the context in which we seek to understand early development and difficulty is the classroom. And classrooms are this incredibly unique setting because we're taking a bunch of kids in a pre-K environment. It's typically about 20 with 2 adults. And what's so interesting about early education is this is the first schooling experience for a large number of kids. And we like to think of the classroom context as a homogeneous setting, that all kids are experiencing the same thing, but they're not. And so every one of those 16, 20, 24 kids is having a really individualized experience in terms of the context in which they're playing and interacting, their interactions with teachers and peers, the relationships that they have. For instance, if you take a child and you think of their 20 peers or classmates, there's some kids for whom they have a lot of conflict and others that they're very close. And then also, we're really interested in that peer social network. And so, if you focus down on, say, any given classroom, I'm just going to keep using the number 20. You got 20 of these little kids running around. They create a network. Obviously, it's very dynamic. You have this child is friends with these kids today and they're frenemies tomorrow, but there's this network. And one of the things we're going to talk more about briefly is the importance of isolation from that network. So you have this group of, say, 24-year-olds, and what happens when you have a child who's pushed to the edge of that social network? So the point that we've been making in our research and pursuing increased understanding is, what's the developmental importance of these individualized experiences? We have been increasingly publishing in this space. A lot of our interest focuses on what's called peer effects. And the peer effects phenomenon is such that one is influenced by the peers with whom they share a certain space and interact. So, um, most of the people tuning in, let's just say you're over there in Marietta, affiliated with the Ohio Valley Early Service Educational Service Center, and you work in a school that has 40 teachers from pre-K to, say, grade 5. That group of 40 teachers creates a network, and you are influenced by the other 40 people in that network. Let's just say all those 40 teachers are really interested in OSU football, and that's all they talk about. So you might enter the school year and say, I don't give a hoot about OSU football, but by the end of the year, you're probably going to be increasingly interested because of that peer effect. And the same thing is true with little kids. When we drop them in a classroom, they influence one another, and that's called a peer effect, and it's something that we can reliably measure. So, a broader focus, as I referenced, is a situation called social exclusion. And social exclusion is when you have a child or children who has very few or no ties to their peers in the social network. And so here you see this little guy in the corner. There's no ties to other kids in this classroom. And that's what we call an isolate. When you have a child or an adolescent or an adult who is isolated from the social network. In early childhood settings, kids do this. They exhibit what we call social preference, where young kids prefer to play and interact with kids who are often the same gender, racial, ethnic background. We even see preference effects for skill levels, where kids who are highly skilled in, say, language and numeracy want to interact with other kids who are highly skilled as well. So we see this, what we call sorting, happen due to a normal developmental process called preference, where kids prefer interacting with others Nothing wrong with that. But due to this preference, you see kids push to the extremes of the classroom social network and become what we call isolated or excluded. Social exclusion, in my opinion, and from what research tells us, is not a positive circumstance. So, for kids who are excluded, and this begins in preschool settings, but can certainly be observed in children, youth, adolescents, and adults, social exclusion leads to internalizing behaviors like anxiety, loneliness. We see low self worth. And we also see kids who are socially excluded increasingly develop academic difficulties and social behavioral issues. It's really not hard to empathize with this. I don't know, 10 years ago, I used to be on Facebook. um, I got off, and that what we might call FOMO, or fear of missing out, or seeing, maybe Logan has a huge party and I see pictures of it and he doesn't invite me. Logan, don't do that. But I think we can all empathize with feelings of exclusion, and what we do see in the research on social exclusion in pre-K, in the early elementary grades, is exclusion is associated with a lot of vulnerabilities and adverse circumstances. So I know that we have early childhood educators and speech language pathologists here. For a number of years, we've been studying kids who have language disorders and examining their experiences with social exclusion in preschool settings. We are very interested in inclusive special education preschool programs. So, in inclusive programs, and Ohio generally adheres to what we would call a 50-50 model, where you would have 50 kids with IEPs designating special education services, 50% typical peers. That's an inclusive setting. There's certainly other ways these can be conceptualized, but the idea behind an inclusive setting is A, to provide kids with disabilities the least restrictive environment for their education, and number two, minimally to provide exposure to and interactions with typically developing peers. That's the ideal. What actually happens? And so if you look at this slide, on the right side, the thing that looks like a globe is actually the social network in 83 early childhood special education classrooms. So I know you can't see these very closely, but we went into 83 early childhood special education classrooms from all over Ohio. This was quite a long time ago, probably 10 years. And we mapped the social network in each of those classrooms. And then we looked specifically at kids with disabilities and kids with developmental language disorder. DLD is typically defined as a child who has a specific language issue, meaning they have a language disability in absence of other significant comorbid conditions. And it may be hard to see this, but if you look at all the black dots, squares, and circles, the kids who are represented by black nodes are kids with disabilities. And kids with disabilities. And what you see when you analyze this more closely is kids who are black nodes, kids with unidentified disability, tend to be on the margins of each classroom social network. The number one predictor of being an isolate, let's see if we get, here's an isolate down here. So it's a child who has few or no ties to the rest of the classroom social network. The number one predictor of isolation is having an IEP, designating a disability. Number two, language skills. And then we also forget the gender issue. I'm not going to talk about that. But basically, if you have a child who has a disability, if you have a child who has low language skills, and those often go hand in hand, their likelihood of being an isolate on the fringe of that classroom social network in inclusive preschool classrooms skyrockets. Um, so I want to comment briefly on developmental language disorders. That's a population we've been really focused on because there's not too many researchers who study social exclusion in kids with DLD. So DLD occurs when you have a specific language disorder, meaning you have significant lags or difficulties in language in absence of other significant comorbid conditions like autism spectrum disorder, significant intellectual disability like Down syndrome, and so on. A primary disorder of language is the most common reason kids are in early childhood special education. This is also a very heterogeneous group of kids, although the research community would like to think that kids with DLD all look exactly the same. That's absolutely not the case. And you know this looking at your kids who have a primary disorder of language. We see all sorts of interesting comorbid conditions like epilepsy, behavior problems, attention issues, mood disorders. But regardless, what we also know is that young kids with DLD are at a heightened risk for having lifelong issues around academics, social relations, and even employment. I was reading a longitudinal study just the other day, a very large cohort of kids with DLD in the UK, and they were studying post-secondary education and employment for kids with DLD. And they showed even that adults who had had DLD as kids tended to have lower wages. They were more likely to be in part-time jobs, and basically not to have great jobs compared to other kids. So we do want to be concerned about kids with DLD in terms of what can an early childhood special education environment provide young kids that might reduce some of these shorter term and then long run concerns. If you hate charts, I apologize, but I'm going to tell you exactly what this table represents. When we look at, so this fancy label here says individual degree centrality. That's a complicated term that in essence means how many I don't know why I'm putting it in quotes. How many playmates does a child have? So that's a social network term, individual degree centrality, but it basically means how many ties do you have with other kids in your classroom? And what we have found is that the number of ties a child has is significantly correlated with kids' language skills, and in particular, what we call the pragmatic aspects of language. So basically, as pragmatic language skills go down, a child's number of playmate peers in the classroom go down. So there's a very intricate tie between your pragmatic language skills and your ties to other kids in the classroom. Now, every early educator and speech language pathologist participating right now is going, well, of course. But we haven't had research to show how important pragmatic language skills are for kids to cement ties with others in that classroom social network. For folks who don't know what pragmatic language skills are, the pragmatic aspect of language is one's ability to use language for social purposes. So it might be the ability to use language to enter into and exit conversations, the ability to stay on topic in conversations, the ability to use language to ask another child to play, and so on and so forth. So it's really that social dimension of language. And so this is repetitive. I just wanted to make the point that when we look at kids with language disorders in early childhood special education classrooms, this is the social network of one inclusive classroom. And here what you see is these kids who are represented by black nodes. These are actually kids with a primary disorder of language. And what you see is they're really pushed to the margins and they have fewer ties to typically developing kids. I want to comment briefly on how in the world do we measure social isolation? There's a lot of ways to do this. It's actually not that difficult. We often rely on a teacher grid where teachers get a grid of all the kids in their classroom and they will simply note on a scale of 1 to 4 how often do these two kids interact. So for Laura and Logan, the teacher might say 4. I see these kids interacting all the time. And for Laura and Rebecca, it might say 1. I rarely see them together. Sorry, Rebecca, we'll work on that. So teachers actually are really good at representing the degree of interaction between pairs of kids in their classrooms. We have been relying over the last 5 years on sensing tools. And Logan will share I might be sharing some data we're finding where kids in classrooms, they wear this little pouch. And in the pouch is, they're wearing it's an RFI. Well, Logan can talk about it. We've changed technology a couple times. So basically, they wear a tag that links up to beacons in the classroom that measure proximity. And then they wear voice activated recorders. This is an example of that beacon. And so what we're able to do is capture all talk and proximity in a classroom over the course of the day. And then we can actually very precisely say, okay, if this is Rebecca, this is how many other kids she interacts with. These are the words they use. This is the sentence they used. And so these are continuous monitors that allow us a lot of precision. One of the things I wanted to show you is this. This is hot off the press using those sensing data. I think it's 29 classrooms. Logan will have no problem correcting me if I'm wrong. But kids wore these sensors, I'm just going to say 29 classrooms over the course of multiple days. Whoa, what just happened? And so what you see here is, again, these are using those sensors. So these are really precise representation of incoming and outgoing talk to peers. These are kids who have language concerns in scarlet. Those are kids where the teacher has concerns or they have an IEP. And what you see is they experience less incoming peer talk over the course of multiple observations. They have less outgoing peer talk, but they're having similar amounts of ingoing and outgoing talk with teachers. So this is that isolation effect that when you have kids with language concerns, language disabilities, they're having less interactions with their peers in the classroom. They're not having less interaction with teachers. And some of these kids are going to experience true isolation. So everybody, I think, here today is an interventionist, either by being a speech language pathologist, an educator, early interventionist. And we too are very interested in, well, what can we do about this? We recognize social isolation is real. We're concerned about it. And so we've been experimenting with interventions where we really try to disrupt this isolation. And Logan is going to take it from here. Logan, do you need screen control?
I'm good to go. I just
You're
swapped it
good to
back.
go.
Yep. Also, I
Cool.
can confirm it was 29 classrooms, so good memory.
Cool.
Um, so yeah, I'm going to talk about a recent randomized controlled trial we conducted for the National Institutes of Health, where we developed and tested a peer-mediated intervention called promoting early engagements, relationships, and socialization. For this project, we worked closely with one of our collaborators who has vast experience with working with these interventions with older students and youth to adapt a peer-mediated intervention specifically for the preschool context. And the goal of this intervention was to disrupt the patterns of social isolation that we see for children with language concerns and ultimately foster greater rates of connections in the form of peer interactions with their classmates. So peer-mediated interventions are interventions implemented by classroom peers. It's important to note that this doesn't involve simply strategically grouping kids together and telling them to hang out and play together. The teacher does have an active role in the intervention in the form of providing support and sort of ongoing guidance to the children who are implementing a variety of strategies that we'll talk more about here in a couple slides. The interventions are primarily designed for use with older populations, if you looked to the literature, and most commonly studies published are the interventions are used to support children with autism. They're regarded as one of the most effective evidence-based practices for supporting students experiencing social exclusion. So the peers intervention that we developed is 12 weeks in duration, and it involves two well-connected peers within the classroom using three specific strategies that are designed to increase the peer interactions for a socially excluded preschooler. The intervention is designed to be implemented specifically during center time or free play. And we decided to do this for multiple reasons. First, a large portion of the day, as many of you know, is spent in either free play or center time. Um, this is often when children who experience social exclusion are the most excluded because of the peer dynamics that happen during this period of the school day. So children can freely wander about the classroom and select their interaction partners. So oftentimes this is when we see social exclusion manifest in the classroom. And then lastly, because large portions of the day are devoted to free play, this is a period where children really have the opportunity to engage in prolonged peer interactions, which is exactly what this intervention was targeting. So as I said before, the intervention involves two well-connected peers implementing specific strategies. There are three strategies that they implement, one per session. There are 3 sessions per week over the course of a 12-week period. For the first 2 weeks of the intervention, the children implementing the intervention complete training via a storybook with their teacher. The storybook is divided into 3 sections, and each of those sections correspond to one of the 3 strategies that they're implementing. So the strategies are invite the target child to play, talk to the target child about what's happening or what you're doing while you're playing together, and praise the target child. And this can be verbal praise or even just we encouraged high fives. There were a lot of high fives happening in these classrooms. Um, at the end of each training session, the teachers provide opportunities for the buddies implementing the intervention to role play, practice using the strategy, and then at the end of the session, they set goals for using the strategy during free play. And then even after that 2-week period, for the entire duration of the 12-week intervention, the kids continue to set goals with their teachers for using the strategy that's being targeted for that specific day. The teacher's role here is, in addition to setting goals, is to sort of monitor the children's implementation and provide support as needed and reinforcement to ensure that the strategies are regularly implemented with the target child. So we were really careful and intentional about the design of this intervention. Part of that was sort of when the project occurred. We received our funding during COVID. And so this really afforded us the time and space to carefully consider how to develop an intervention that was not cumbersome to teachers or kids and that was feasible to incorporate into teachers' already busy schedules. So, as part of the development, once things opened back up in spring and we were able to re-enter the schools, we conducted a small pilot study with one of our partners in one preschool classroom to test out the intervention to see if we could sort of get a signal of intervention effects, and then also to get feedback from teachers and children on the intervention. The pilot showed that target children trended overall toward an increased interaction with their peers. And importantly, teachers reported that they felt that the intervention was feasible to implement, that they felt it was effective in supporting the target child in their interactions with peers. And teachers also reported that they felt it was appropriate for use in their classroom. For some reason, there's a lag when I click the arrow. Thank you for your patience. There we go. So here are two figures that we created using data from this pilot. The first one shows the proportion of time the socially isolated target child engaged in peer interactions over the course of the pilot. The solid line represents their incoming interactions with peers, and the dotted line represents their outgoing interactions with peers. And you can see that overall, it's a little bit stochastic. You can see it jumping up and down, but overall, we can see that the target child's peer interactions trended toward an increase over the course of the pilot. And then the second figure here on the right shows the proportion of time the target child spent in proximity to buddies or the kids implementing the intervention, and that's represented in the solid line, and then non-buddies, so the broader peer social network in the classroom, and that's represented by the dotted line. And you can see that there's a spike here in the middle of the intervention, and you can also see that the target child was spending more time in proximity to buddies than other kids in the classroom, which is a signal that the intervention was being implemented, but there is a tapering off there at the end as well. So after the pilot, we made some minor updates to the intervention and the training storybook based upon feedback that we received from teachers. We then transitioned into the larger RCT to test the effects of peers on children's peer interactions and their sociolinguistic outcomes. To that end, we recruited 25 preschool classrooms. 12 of these were randomly assigned to the treatment group, and 13 were randomly assigned to the control group. So just business as usual. Across all 25 classrooms, we selected one target child who was socially isolated and had language concerns expressed by the teacher, and two buddies. And these buddies were the kiddos who implemented the intervention. So as I said, target children were those who we identified as having teachers expressed concerns about their language, but they also had the lowest language scores in the classroom and the lowest in degree centrality. So Laura talked a little bit about degree centrality. This is a similar social network measure of connectedness, but it's an actual measure of the total number of incoming ties with peers that a child has. For the buddies who implemented the intervention, they were essentially the inverse of this. So they had high language scores. The teacher did not express any concerns about their language abilities, and they had the highest in degree centrality score. Here are some descriptives for target children and the buddies. We can see that target children have lower language scores and in degree centrality as compared to their buddies. And we can also see here that target children in the treatment group were a bit lower than children in control classrooms across both their language skills and their in degree centrality. Here's a timeline for the study. So we started by recruiting those 25 classrooms. We assessed kids' language skills in the autumn and spring using the PLS expressive subscale. Teachers also completed an initial questionnaire to provide basic demographic information and child-specific items on children's social skills, their play relationships, and their pragmatic language skills in autumn. They then completed these same questionnaires in the spring. We use the data collected in autumn to select one target child and two buddies in each classroom. And throughout the year, we collected 30-minute in-person researcher observations at 4 time points, and then we collected sensing observations at 8 time points using our system called interaction detection in early academic settings. And I'm happy to talk. I'm a little bit tight on time, but I'm happy to talk more about that sensing system during the Q&A if folks are curious. 13 of the classrooms maintained business as usual, so they just continued going about their normal programming. And then 12 of the classrooms implemented the peers intervention between January and May, three times per week. And the goal of the intervention, again, was to increase these social interactions for target children and ultimately get them more connected to the classroom social network. We focused on two types of outcomes. So in the short term, we wanted to see if the intervention would impact target children's peer interactions measured at multiple time points over the school year via both our sensing system and researcher observations. And then we also looked at children's cooperative play with peers using the in-person researcher observations. In the longer term, we wanted to examine whether the peers intervention exposure and their increased exposure to those peer interactions was associated with an improvement in target children's play centrality, their social behavior skills, and their expressive and pragmatic language skills. To that end, we ran a series of t-tests and multi-level models to look at the impacts of peers for increasing target children's peer interactions. And then we also ran a multi-level model to look at the impacts of peers for increasing target children's play centrality and their language and social outcomes. And in that model, we controlled for time point one score and age. So for this slide, I just want to note that these findings are super preliminary. These are from a very simple model or series of models that we ran, and we're working on running more complex analyses in the future. But these are data from the sensing system, and they're looking at treatment control differences on target children's interactions and proximity to buddies. And we could see here that we found that target children in the treatment group spoke significantly more to their buddies and received more incoming talk from their buddies as measured by our sensing system. Interestingly, they did spend less time in proximity to buddies based upon our findings. We have some thoughts on that, and again, I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A. We also ran some analyses using data from our researcher observations that we collected at 4 time points, and we found that target children in treatment classrooms engaged in significantly more incoming talk or outgoing talk to peers. They experienced more incoming talk from peers, and they also engaged in significantly more cooperative play as compared to children in control classrooms. And then lastly, we looked at children's social and linguistic outcomes. So target children in the treatment group showed significant gains in their behavior control compared to kiddos in the control classrooms. We did not observe any significant intervention effects for assertiveness, pure social skills, teacher-rated play centrality, or target children's language skills.
Logan, can I make a quick comment though?
Of course.
So we remember so one of the things we did earlier this year is we examined language gains specifically for kids in the peers intervention who had language concerns. And so of the 25 kids, that's 25 kids total, one per classroom, who got the well, half of them got the peers intervention. They didn't all have a language disability. We identified the kids with the lowest language skills and the most isolated. We reanalyzed data for 14 kids who had language concerns and found a significant gain in language skill for those kids compared to kids in control classrooms. Wasn't that right, Logan? Or am I making stuff up?
Those kids had IEPs, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. So
Yes.
all of the kids in this study, the teacher did express language concerns in autumn on that autumn survey, but those follow-on analyses, we just focused on the kids with individualized education plans.
Yeah. So for kids though who had a IEP for language, we saw an insignificant increase in language over the year compared to kids in control classrooms.
Just really quick to wrap this up because I want to give some time for Q&A. Overall, the results suggest that the intervention does hold promise for improving the social experiences of socially isolated preschoolers, but further work is needed, including what Laura just highlighted, to understand how these increased social experiences may be associated with children's social and linguistic outcomes in the longer term. In terms of future directions, we have some ideas for refining the peers intervention based upon lessons learned. We also want to expand the capability of our sensing system so that it can provide real-time feedback to teachers so that they can monitor intervention effectiveness and also more broadly just identify children in the classroom in real time who may be experiencing social exclusion.
Logan, how would you refine the intervention based on lessons learned? You brought it up.
Yeah, so one of the things we've talked about doing is including the target child in the training process. Um, Also doing a longer training, um, and then additionally having regular check-ins with the teacher and the buddy where they talk about just what it's like to be connected to friends, to play with friends, etc.
And Logan, I see it one question. I don't even know if people can see me. Am I actually on the screen? I don't know.
Yes, you are on the screen.
Oh, I could just be a voice from the forest, but I just saw a question about, do you have a lot of books you used? I think I know what this question is about. Logan, I'm going to shut up after this.
No, you're good. We're
Um,
wrapping up, so that's perfect.
okay. So we did the 2 weeks of training buddies. We call them buddies, the peers, in the first 2 weeks of the intervention. And we mentioned using a book. We actually made a book for the purpose of this study. Logan showed a illustration from that where we created a narrative of teachers and kids in classrooms, and teachers were actually using things like high fives. So we created a book to train the buddies in using our strategies. We don't love our book,
We do
so
not love our book.
if you are a famed children's author, please contact us. You can help us with the revision. But the strategies are great. It's just the illustration and storyline we think we can improve.
I
Thank
got a
you.
request for the reference QR code, so I'm going to share momentarily, and
Yes, thank you, Logan.
you are welcome.
Well, thank you both for the presentation. We are moving into the Q&A session. We have some questions coming in already, but if you have a question for our speakers, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. One clarifying question that came in was if you could define and sort of give some examples for what behavioral control looks like, that outcome measure.
Logan, that is from the measure, the TCRS. And
Yes.
it looks at 4 dimensions of what we would call social behavioral competence. Can you describe the behavioral control outcomes?
I would feel more comfortable if I look back at the measure as opposed to just reciting items off the top of
Okay.
my head.
I think that, not I think, the behavioral control really would be synonymous with inhibitory control, often considered a measure of executive function. So behavioral control generally is being able to withhold a dominant response. In other words, um, you have a child, you have two kids in a classroom, one child reaches over to grab a toy from one kid. The dominant response is, I'm going to hit him in the face. Don't do that to me. And you want to be able to control that behavior and ideally use a more proactive behavior, like say, please give me my toy. So that would
Logan
be
is showing us some of examples of the items on the screen.
So yeah, it measures kids' ability to self-regulate or manage their own behaviors and emotions, adapt or conform to limits and rules within the school environment, and focus or maintain attention and task orientation.
Great, thank you. One question came in about differences between the sensing measures that you use and teacher perception. So did you observe any differences in teacher perceptions of children's social skills or network or isolation versus what was observed by the audio and the trackers? Just curious if teachers already know which children are experiencing peer isolation or not.
Yeah, so we there was actually a study done a while ago where they looked at alignment across these
Mhm.
measures, and generally they are pretty well aligned. As Laura said earlier in the talk, there are a number of ways to sort of identify these isolates. Folks use, in addition to teacher report, folks use the peer nomination task where children actually nominate the peers with whom they commonly play. And then folks also use sensing systems, but they don't typically use sensing systems to actually identify isolates. It's more just to objectively measure their peer interactions over time. But in terms of, so we use teacher report to actually identify our isolates. And in terms of the measures that are commonly used, it's regarded as one of the most accurate forms of identifying isolates, given that teachers are, as you pointed out with your question, very familiar with the dynamics of the classroom. And they typically know um, which children are experiencing social exclusion. That also goes for the buddies who are implementing the peer intervention.
Mhm.
Teachers typically know who the best candidates in the classroom are for those kids. So in addition to those selection criteria, we actually consulted teachers just to confirm that the kiddos implementing the intervention would be a good fit. And if you look to the peer-mediated intervention literature, there are some early studies where they just directly ask teachers who they think would be the right child for that role.
Great, thank you. Several people asking, you mentioned the finding that proximity was actually reduced in the intervention condition for their buddies. Can you talk about several questions coming in asking if you could talk some more about what you think happened there?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a very good example of how these innovative technologies are very useful for measuring interactions in the classroom, but they should by no means replace humans actually observing what's happening in preschool classrooms. So the way the proximity measurement works is there is a 1.5 meter threshold. There's a location beacon that Laura kind of talked about briefly that the child's wearing, and it communicates with these antennae that are around the classroom. And we're able to use that to determine thresholds of distance. And so the way proximity is operationalized in this study, and it's based on a lot of earlier studies, is 1.5 meters. So if children are within 1.5 meters of one another, they're considered in proximity. That's around 5 feet roughly. If they're outside of that 1.5 meter distance, they're not considered in proximity. And we know just actually observing preschool classrooms that kids can be playing together, like in a block area or a dramatic play area, and they can be interacting and playing together, but they may be beyond that 1.5 meter threshold. And so in those instances, even though the children are close to one another and they're interacting, the system's not going to classify that as the children actually being in proximity to one another, whereas an in-person researcher would be able to clearly identify that.
Thanks. We're going to add to that, Laura. Good. Thanks. Okay. Um, we had another question about if you've considered the effect of children's mental health on isolation, or if there's other research looking at that.
The all the early work on social isolation. Well, I'm not quite sure if the asker is asking about the effects of isolation on mental health, or if mental health contributes to isolation. But about 20 years ago, I was talking to a psychologist who was studying social isolation. And at that time, all the research I was aware of was really focused on how social isolation contributes to mental health concerns. And it was probably the first research conversation that I was ever in where I had a really big emotional response, where I was thinking about kids who are, I mean, people consider social isolation a form of victimization. And so you have kids who are excluded from the classroom social network. It's a form of victimization. I don't usually like to use that word with preschool kids because there's a lot of normal developmental processes that are happening around preference. But it wasn't hard for me to imagine how repeated social exclusion over time leads to very, very significant mental health problems. And so we're really focused on social isolation in kids with developmental language disorders because it's very, very clear that language grows through environmental exposure to language. And so when kids are excluded from verbal interactions with other kids, we're really robbing them of a mechanism for language growth. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Thanks. A couple of questions have come in about the specific characteristics of the children and the buddies. So first, what percentage of the target children are AAC users, augmentative and alternative communication users? And then if you looked at whether the effects of the target kid or the buddies being English language learners and any effects of that in your analysis.
So I'll take the first one, and then Logan, can you recall the sample in terms of ELLs? But none of the kids were AAC users. And so I apologize for those of you who are really interested in and focused on AAC users. I am very aware of the reality of AAC users in inclusive classrooms, and the fact that there is, well, we always have to acknowledge that there are masterful teachers and clinicians who do a lot to promote real social inclusion. But it's very easy for AAC users to be pushed aside. And I'm not aware of any studies looking at the social networks of AAC users in preschool special ed classrooms. So it would really be anecdotal. Logan, can you comment on kids who are learning English as a second language in the Peers study?
Sure. So 0 of the children were English language learners, and that's not because of any exclusionary criteria in our study. It was just by virtue of how recruitment played out in the sample. Also, going back to the question about AAC users, there are some studies where they've used peer-mediated intervention specifically with children who use AAC devices. So if they may be in the references that I showed before, but if you're curious, I'm happy to connect you to those studies if you'd like.
Logan, correct me here. In the 25 Peers classrooms, no target kid or buddy were English language learners, but were there ELLs in the
There were
classrooms?
in the classrooms, they
Yes.
just weren't selected
Yes.
for
Yeah.
involvement in the intervention.
Yes. And a lot of in that particular study, it wasn't that long after COVID. And so our more diverse school districts in Central Ohio were not yet letting researchers in. And so we were working in a lot of community-based preschool settings in more suburban and rural parts of Ohio where we see, frankly, we see more segregation in our, segregation in terms of, well, I think you know what I mean. But a lot of the classrooms did not have a lot of ELLs.
Thank you. I'll try to get one more question in very briefly. Just a couple people asking about, any takeaways that folks can take away to their classrooms from this conversation or their schools or resources for more information.
What I want to say is that I am a speech language pathologist, and my passion is and always has been kids who have language disorders and the importance of, number one, early education as a way to promoting language development in kids with language disorders, but also the social environment. And as a person in the speech language research community, I'm really confused by the lack of research on kids with language disorders and peer interactions. I think it's a real miss. Everybody who studies language development knows that the number one fuel source for language development is verbal input from others, and that includes peers. So I'm excited by this work, and I think it has real implications for practice. And those of you who are acting professionals participating today, do feel free to share with us what you're doing in this space.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, this has been a wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you again for sharing your work with us. I will wrap up here a few minutes early to leave folks time to fill out a short survey. Janelle, I think, can add those to the screen or the chat. We just have a few questions, and it'll only take a minute or two. Your responses are really valuable to us, and we do aim to get close to 100% participation on these because your feedback really does help us shape future events. So Janelle just has that on the screen now. If you can scan that QR code and fill that out, it's just a few quick questions, and we really appreciate getting your feedback. Thank you all for joining us today.